Feel the evening silence as it envelops you like a warm and gentle blanket. All the light of day, all the sounds, and all the worries are slowly dissolving into the tranquil twilight that draws ever closer. In this quiet space, we shall set out upon a journey, not to lands far away, but into the very depths of time, to the headwaters of the thought that continues to shape our world. Our lullaby begins in ancient Greece, at a time when philosophy was taking its first, still uncertain, steps. Let us imagine the night sky above the Ionian coast. It is boundless, deep, of velvet blackness, strewn with billions of stars that shimmer with a cold and indifferent light. It was upon this very sky, upon the majestic movement of the celestial bodies, upon the mystery of the dawns and the sunsets, that the gazes of the first thinkers were fixed, those whom we call the pre-Socratics. Their souls yearned to comprehend the universe. Their questions were monumental, cosmic in their scale. This was an age when sages, gazing out at the world, tried to discover its first principle, its archu. One of them, Thales of Miletus, while walking beside the sea, observing the mists that rose from the water and the rains that nourished the earth, came to believe that all things are born of water. Water is flexible, changeable. It can exist as vapor, liquid, and ice. It is the giver of life. Could it be the very building material from which the entire world is sculpted? His thought flowed onward like a serene river, attempting to embrace all of existence. Another thinker, Anaximander, perceived the world in a different way. He could not accept that something as specific as water could give birth to its own opposite, fire. He searched for something deeper, something undefined and limitless. He called it the apeiron, an infinite, eternal, and elusive substance from which everything arises and to which everything returns, much like waves that are born from the ocean and once more become the ocean. This was a thought that reached far beyond the visible realm, attempting to touch eternity itself. And then came Heraclitus, the obscure sage from Ephesus. He saw the world not as something stable, but as an eternal flow, a ceaseless transformation. Everything flows, everything changes. He would whisper, "You cannot step into the same river twice." For him, the first principle was fire, dynamic, restless, the element that constantly transforms all that it touches. The world for Heraclitus was a harmony born from the conflict of opposites, day and night, hot and cold, life and death. These first philosophers were true giants of thought. They were poets, physicists, and astronomers. Their gazes were cast outward and upward toward the shimmering stars and the profound laws of nature. They asked, of what is the world made? How is the cosmos structured? But within their magnificent theories of water, air, fire, and numbers, there was almost no space left for one small yet incredibly complex element, the human being itself. Questions of how a person ought to live, what goodness is, what justice is, all remained in the shadows of these grand cosmological enigmas. But then, in the bustling, sun-drenched city of Athens, upon its dusty streets, and in its noisy public squares, a figure appeared who would alter the course of everything. He was not like the sages who had come before. He wrote no treatises, and in the traditional sense had no school of his own. He was a man of short, sturdy build, with prominent eyes and a flattened nose. His name was Socrates, and he ignited a revolution in philosophy without moving a single stone. He simply began to ask different questions. Socrates, like a careful gardener, shifted the focus of philosophy from the immense garden of the cosmos to the small yet equally mysterious garden of the human soul. He was not interested in whether the world was made of water or fire. He was deeply concerned with what constitutes a worthy life. He walked barefoot through the Athenian agora, the central square where life was teeming, and he spoke with everyone, with artisans, politicians, poets, and soldiers. He offered them no ready-made truths. He did something far more unusual. He asked, imagine a proud general who has just returned from a victorious campaign. Socrates would approach him and with a feigned innocence would ask, you are such a brave warrior. Tell me, O valiant one, what exactly is bravery? The general, smiling, would give a seemingly obvious answer. Bravery is holding your position in the line and not fleeing from the enemy. But Socrates would gently press on, and yet is it not true that a tactical retreat can also be a display of wisdom and bravery? And what about fortitude in the face of illness or poverty? Is that not also bravery? Step by step, question by question, Socrates would gently but relentlessly dismantle his companion's self-assuredness. He did not argue, nor did he try to prove his own point. He simply, like a mirror, showed the man the contradictions held within his own beliefs. And finally, the mighty general, who knew everything there was to know about warfare, was compelled to admit that he did not truly know what bravery is. This very transition from the study of nature to the study of human nature was the great turning point. Philosophy descended from the heavens and came down to earth. It entered the homes, the marketplaces, and the souls of people. The main question was no longer what is the world, but who am I? It was not, how do the planets move, but how am I to live my life correctly? This was the profound shift from cosmology to ethics. Socrates believed that evil is committed not from malicious intent, but from ignorance. A person who truly knows what is good will not commit an evil act. Therefore, the most essential task for everyone is the journey of self-knowledge. His famous phrase, "I know that I know nothing," was not an expression of weakness, but the very starting point for true wisdom. For only in acknowledging one's own ignorance can the soul begin its path toward truth. And so, carried by the gentle whisper of this story, we can see how philosophical thought changes its direction. It turns away from the cold light of the distant stars and begins to gaze into the warm, living light that glows within every human being. It starts to seek its foundation, not in the laws of the universe, but in the laws of the soul. This transition from the boundless cosmos to the boundless world within the human person became the very cradle for all of Western philosophy that was to follow. It prepared the ground for Socrates' student, Plato, who would then attempt to reunite these two worlds, the world of eternal ideas and the world of human life. The figure of Socrates dissolved into history, his voice falling silent upon the bustling Athenian streets. He left behind not a single written line, not one treatise, not a single testament carved in stone. His philosophy lived on only in the memories of those who had heard him, in the echo of his unsettling questions, in that intellectual spark he would ignite in the souls of those he spoke with. And so his most brilliant student, the young aristocrat Plato, was faced with a monumental and almost impossible task: how to preserve not merely the words, but the very spirit the living method of his teacher. How could he pass down to future generations not a collection of finished dogmas, but the art of thinking itself, the art of the shared search for truth? Plato could have chosen the traditional path. He could have composed long, structured treatises where he would lay out a philosophical system step by step. This would have been an understandable and respected way. A treatise is a monument to a thought. It is majestic, stable, and clear. But it was in this very monumentality that Plato saw a profound danger. In his later reflections, he compared the written text to a painting. The figures that are painted look as though they are alive, but if you approach them with a question, they will only gaze back at you, silent and majestic. They cannot explain anything, add anything, nor can they defend themselves if someone happens to misinterpret them. The written text, in Plato's view, was a dead word. It is fixed, frozen. It drifts about the world, falling into the hands of the discerning and the undiscerning alike, and it cannot choose for itself a worthy conversationalist. It does not know when it ought to speak and when it ought to remain silent. It provides only the illusion of knowledge. A person, after reading a book, might believe they now know everything, when in truth they have merely memorized the thoughts of another without ever having given birth to their own. This is knowledge without effort, knowledge without an inner transformation. And for Plato, as it was for Socrates, true knowledge was not information, but a state of the soul, the result of a difficult internal journey. Another path that lay before him was the path of poetry. Greece was a civilization raised upon the epics of Homer and the verses of the great lyric poets. It was poetry that was considered the wellspring of wisdom, morality, and inspiration. Plato himself had written poems in his youth. He could have clothed his philosophical ideas in the grand robes of the hexameter, created hymns in praise of the form of the good, or epics about the immortality of the soul. But he rejected this path as well. Plato regarded poetry with great caution. He understood its magical, enchanting power. Poetry, in his opinion, appeals not to reason, but to the emotions, to the irrational part of the soul. It is able to captivate, to arouse, to bring forth tears or joy, but it does not lead one toward clear, pure understanding. The poet, in creating his images, is imitating not true reality, the world of eternal ideas, but only its shadows, the world of visible things. His art is an illusion squared, a copy of a copy. It can nourish the passions in the soul, pity, fear, and in doing so weaken the authority of reason, which ought to be the guide of a person's entire inner world. And so poetry is a sweet but dangerous medicine, one that clouds the soul's vision instead of making it sharper. And here, on the intellectual stage of Athens, a third power held sway, one with which Plato waged an irreconcilable war. These were the sophists, teachers of wisdom, as they called themselves. They were brilliant orators, virtuosos of the word. They traveled from city to city, offering, for a fee, to teach anyone the art of eloquence, the skill of convincing others of anything at all. For the sophists, objective truth did not exist. Man is the measure of all things, proclaimed one of the most famous among them, Protagoras. This meant that truth is relative, unique to each person. What matters is not what is truly real, but what you can prove to be true in a court of law, in a public assembly, or simply in a debate. Their word was a weapon, an instrument for achieving success, wealth, and power. They delivered long, ornate, masterfully constructed speeches that would mesmerize a crowd, confound an opponent, and leave no space for questions. Their goal was not a collaborative search, but a solitary victory. Their method was the monologue, a rhetorical demonstration of force. And so it is, in this context between the silent dead treatise, the emotional yet deceptive poetry, and the self-assured relativistic monologue of the sophists, that Plato discovers his unique path. He chooses the dialogue. The dialogue became for him the perfect form, a living vessel for a living thought. It was a decision of pure genius. The dialogue is not merely a literary device, it is philosophy itself in action. It allowed Plato to preserve the most precious thing he had from Socrates, his method. On the pages of Plato's dialogues, Socrates continues to live. He once again walks the streets of Athens, once again poses his questions, once again patiently guides his companions through the labyrinths of their own conceptions. Unlike the treatise, the dialogue is dynamic. It reveals not the finished result of thinking, but the process itself, with its hesitations, its errors, its sudden flashes of insight, and most importantly, its moments of aporia, that state of impasse, of bewilderment, when a person realizes that all their previous knowledge was flawed. It was this very state of intellectual purification that Plato considered the necessary first step toward genuine knowing. Unlike poetry, the dialogue appeals to reason. It is a drama of ideas, not of passions. Each argument is meticulously considered, analyzed, and tested for its integrity. The pace of the conversation is slow, deliberate. The goal is not to enchant, but to clarify, and most importantly, the dialogue became the ideal antidote to sophistry. Where the sophist delivered a monologue, the philosopher in the dialogue insisted on short questions and answers. He did not allow a flood of eloquence to conceal a weakness of position. The dialogue demands intellectual honesty. You cannot simply declare something to be true. You must justify it, respond to objections, and be prepared to admit your own error. In a dialogue, truth does not belong to any one person. It is born in the space between two souls, who together, in a shared respect for reason, for the logos, strive to behold it. In this way, by choosing the form of the dialogue, Plato accomplished much more than simply finding a way to honor his teacher. He created a literary and philosophical instrument of incredible power. He showed that the path to wisdom is not passive reading or emotional rapture. It is an active, shared, sometimes painful, but always living conversation, a conversation in which our own soul is the principal participant. And this conversation, which began more than 2 millennia ago on the pages of his works, continues to this day, inviting each and every one of us to join. And so Plato chose his form, a living, breathing conversation, inscribed upon the pages of papyrus. But a Platonic dialogue is not merely a casual chat over a glass of wine. It is a finely tuned instrument, an entire workshop for the shaping of human thought. Within this workshop, there are unique tools, each with its own purpose and function. To understand how the miracle of philosophical inquiry occurs, we must peer inside and examine these tools more closely. This is a journey into the very mechanics of the Socratic method, into the heart of how truth is born. The first instrument, which nearly every one of Socrates' companions encounters, is the sharpest and often the most painful. It is called elenchus. This word can be translated as cross-examination, refutation, or exposure. It is the method of meticulously testing any given statement for its integrity. Imagine the human soul as a garden. Over the years, Various plants have grown in this garden. These are our convictions, our ideas about the world, about good and evil, about justice and beauty. Some of them we planted ourselves, but most have grown from seeds carried on the wind of public opinion, upbringing, and tradition. We have grown accustomed to them. We consider them a part of ourselves. And then comes Socrates, the strange gardener of souls. He does not offer us new exotic flowers. Instead, he begins to carefully inspect what is already growing in our garden. He takes one of our strongest held beliefs, for example, justice is speaking the truth and paying one's debts, and begins to gently weed around it. That is a wonderful definition, he says. But imagine that a friend of yours, while in his right mind, has left a weapon with you for safekeeping, and now he returns in a fit of madness and demands it back. Would it be just to tell him the truth about where the weapon is and to return it to him? Would not such justice lead to a terrible evil? With a single question like this, he creates a fissure in the monolith of our certainty. Then he poses another and another after that. He does not argue, does not shout, does not impose his own opinion. He only pulls at the logical threads that protrude from our own assertion, and he shows us that they are tangled, that they contradict one another. The process of Elentius is a process of intellectual purification. It is the slow, methodical freeing of the soul from the weeds of false beliefs, from the stones of prejudice, from the illusion of knowledge. It is the preparation of the soil, and before anything can be sown, the ground must be made clean. When the Elentius achieves its aim, a second exceptionally important state arrives. It is called aporia. This Greek word means impasse, difficulty, or dead end. It is the moment when Socrates' interlocutor, who at the start of the conversation was filled with confidence in his own knowledge, suddenly falls silent. He is bewildered, lost. All of his familiar answers have proven to be inadequate. The path he was walking with such certainty has led him into an impassable thicket. Imagine a traveler in a familiar forest who suddenly realizes that all the paths have vanished. The sun is hidden behind the clouds, and he has absolutely no idea which way to turn. This is aporia. For many, it is a state of frustration and even shame. But for Socrates and Plato, aporia is not a defeat. It is the highest point of the first stage of the philosophical ascent. It is that blessed moment of silence when the noise of self-assurance ceases and the soul, for the first time, truly opens itself to the search. It is the admission of one's own ignorance, the I know that I know nothing, which is the very doorway to true wisdom. Only in a state of aporia, when the old maps are useless, does the real journey begin. Most of Plato's early dialogues end on this very note, leaving the reader in a fruitful state of contemplation. But what comes next? Can it be that philosophy is merely the destruction of illusions, leaving a person in a state of confusion? No. And here a third, wonderfully beautiful and humane instrument takes the stage, meutics, or the art of the spiritual midwife. Socrates, whose own mother Phanerete was a midwife, claimed that he practiced the very same craft, only he helped not women to give birth to children, but young minds to give birth to truth. He was convinced that truth already exists within every person's soul. It is merely sleeping, hidden beneath layers of forgetfulness and false notions. This is connected to Plato's theory of anamnesis, of recollection. The soul, before it was embodied, contemplated the world of eternal ideas, and therefore knowledge of them is innate. The task of the philosopher-mentor is not to pour knowledge into a student from the outside, as if into an empty vessel. His task is to help the student to recall that which his soul already knows. Socrates, the midwife, does not give ready-made answers. He asks the right questions, offers encouragement when a thought reaches an impasse, and waits with patience. He helps to distinguish the true viable fruit of thought from a false, stillborn one. This process is profoundly personal, and yet, at the same time, collaborative. It is a sacred mystery in which one soul helps another to give birth to its own self, to its own unborrowed understanding. In this entire complex process, from exposure through elenchus, through the silence of aporia, to the birth of a thought through meutics, is enveloped by a fourth, most subtle element. This is Socratic irony. It is not simply mockery or sarcasm. It is a complex philosophical stance and simultaneously a pedagogical device. Its most famous manifestation is Socrates' constant profession of his own ignorance. Turning to a self-assured expert, he says, "I do not know what virtue is, so I have come to you, a wise man, that you might teach me." This feigned naivety instantly dissolves any tension. The interlocutor, seeing before him not a formidable opponent, but a humble seeker, relaxes and willingly begins to share his knowledge. Irony creates a safe space for exploration, where no one is afraid of appearing foolish, but at the same time, this irony creates distance. It compels us, the readers, to be attentive, to understand that behind the simplicity of the words lies a deep design. It is the soft light that illuminates pride and self-importance, not by burning them away with aggression, but by gently dissolving them within the shared conversation. And so, woven together, these instruments transform a conversation into a powerful mechanism of cognition. Elenchus clears the field, aporia creates a fertile emptiness, meutics helps the new to be born, and all of it is lubricated by the fine oil of irony. This is the living fabric of the Platonic dialogue, an eternal dance of thought that leads from the illusion of knowledge through humble ignorance to the birth of one's own hard-won truth. We have now seen the instruments that Plato and his Socrates operate within the workshop of the dialogue. We have felt the sharpness of elenchus, the silence of aporia, and the wonder of meutics, all veiled in the soft mist of irony. But why all this intricate labor? What is the ultimate purpose of this spiritual craft? The answer lies at the very heart of Platonic philosophy, in the aspiration to lead the human soul out from the world of shifting opinions and into the realm of eternal, unshakable knowledge. It is a journey that leads from the shadows into the light. Plato distinguished between two fundamental levels of understanding, two worlds in which our consciousness can reside. The first, lower level, he called doxa. This word is usually translated as opinion or belief. It is the world of our everyday experience. It consists of unexamined assumptions, popular convictions, truths heard from others, and personal impressions. This is the world in which we all live for most of our lives. Imagine people who have been sitting their entire lives in a deep cave with their backs to the entrance. Behind their backs, a fire is burning, and between them and the fire, various objects are carried past. All that the prisoners can see are the mere shadows of these objects dancing on the wall before them. They believe these shadows to be the one and only reality. This is the realm of doxa. Opinions can sometimes be correct. I might have a correct opinion about how to get from Athens to Larissa, even if I have never been there myself, but have simply heard it from someone. But this opinion is not knowledge. It has no foundation. It is like a beautiful but untethered statue that might topple over at the slightest push. If someone were to challenge me, to question my route, I would be unable to defend it, unable to justify why the specific path is the right one. My certainty is fragile. Most of the convictions that Socrates encounters in his interlocutors are precisely doxa. The general has an opinion about courage, the politician about justice, the poet about beauty, but these opinions are not grounded. They have not passed the test of reason. The higher level of understanding is episteme, true demonstrable knowledge. This is not just a correct opinion, it is a correct opinion that is, in Plato's words, tethered by a chain of justification. Returning to our example, episteme is not simply knowing the route, but understanding the map, knowing the reasons why the road turns here and not there, being able to explain one's path and defend it against any objection. Episteme is seeing not the shadows on the cave wall, but the objects themselves in the clear light of the sun. It is knowledge of the eternal, unchanging ideas, the idea of justice, the idea of beauty, the idea of the good. It is stable, universal, and immutable, and it is here that the true purpose of the dialogue is revealed. The dialogue is that very path, that very process of ascent from the cave of doxa to the light of episteme. Every one of its elements serves this goal. Elenchus, by mercilessly destroying false beliefs, forces the prisoner in the cave to realize that the shadows are merely shadows. This is a painful but necessary moment of insight. Aporia is that moment when the prisoner, having turned away from the wall, is blinded by the light, seeing neither the old shadows nor the new objects, and finds himself in a state of utter confusion. And metutics is the patient assistance of a guide who helps the eyes of the soul to grow accustomed to the light, to learn to distinguish the real things, and finally to dare to look upon the sun itself, the idea of the good. The driving force behind this entire process is the grand and powerful logos. This Greek word holds a multitude of meanings: word, speech, argument, law, reason. In the context of the dialogue, logos is the force of reasoned, rational discourse. It is the guiding principle and the supreme judge of the entire conversation. The participants in the dialogue agree to submit not to authority, not to tradition, not to emotions, but only to the power of the better argument. We must follow wherever the wind of the logos blows. Socrates says, the logos is a shared compass that prevents the ship of conversation from being blown off course. It demands clarity in definitions, consistency in conclusions, and honesty in admitting contradictions. It is the logos that transforms a chaotic dispute of opinions into an orderly, collaborative inquiry. It does not allow one to hide behind beautiful words, as the sophists did. Like a ray of light, it pierces through the fog of rhetoric and illuminates the very essence of the matter. Submitting to the logos requires intellectual courage, the readiness to abandon one's most cherished beliefs if they cannot withstand the scrutiny of reason. From this flows another profound idea. For Plato, truth is not something that can be found alone. The image of the philosopher is not that of a hermit meditating in isolation. True knowing is a collective act. Truth is born in the space between people, in the dynamic of their interaction. Each participant in a dialogue has a limited view, seeing only one facet of the problem, like the blind men feeling an elephant. One says, "It is like a pillar," another, "It is like a rope." Only in the process of communication, by putting together their partial visions, can they begin to approach an understanding of the whole. The dialogue is the art of combining perspectives. I put forward a thesis. You critique it, showing me its weak points, which I could not see. Your critique forces me to refine my thought. In response, I point out the flaws in your objection. And so, step by step, in this process of mutual correction, we build together an understanding far deeper and more robust than what either of us would be capable of alone. Truth here is not a possession to be owned. It is the fruit of a shared effort, a common child, born in the womb of a conversation guided by the logos. Thus the Platonic dialogue appears before us as a grand drama of knowing. It is not merely the form, but the very substance of philosophy. It is a structured, purposeful journey that leads the soul from the fragile and hazy world of opinions and illusions to the solid and clear world of true knowledge. It is a path that demands intellectual labor, honesty with oneself and with others, and most importantly, faith in the all-conquering power of reason. It is an invitation not just to receive knowledge, but to experience its birth in a shared, patient, and meaningful conversation. The dialogues of Plato, which have come down to us through the dense layers of millennia, are not a monolithic slab carved all at once. They are rather a living chronicle of a single great soul, a record of a long, nearly 50-year journey in search of truth. In reading them, we can observe how Plato's thought grows, changes, matures, and even criticizes itself. This path can be compared to the course of a great river. It begins as a swift, ringing mountain stream, sweeping away all obstacles in its path. Then it emerges onto a plain, becoming wide, deep, and full-flowing, nourishing the lands around it. And finally, as it nears the sea, it fans out into a multitude of channels, exploring complex and intricate pathways. These are the three great eras of Plato's creative work: the early, the middle, and the late. The first period consists of the early or Socratic dialogues. This is that very mountain stream. In these texts, written not long after the death of his teacher, Plato acts more as a keeper of memory than as the creator of his own system. The main hero here is always Socrates, alive, breathing, filled with irony and an unquenchable curiosity. He wanders through Athens, accosting people, confounding them with his questions. The atmosphere of these dialogues is tense, dramatic, and charged with the energy of an intellectual duel. The primary aim of these conversations is the search for precise definitions of ethical concepts. In the dialogue Euthyphro, Socrates meets a priest who is about to prosecute his own father and asks him what piety truly is. In the Laches, he interrogates two renowned generals about the nature of courage. In the Charmides, the topic becomes temperance or self-control. Socrates, applying his merciless elenchus, shows that not one of his interlocutors, all of whom consider themselves experts, can provide a satisfactory definition. They offer examples, but they cannot grasp the very essence, the idea of the concept itself. These dialogues, as a rule, end in nothing. That is, they end in a state of aporia, of intellectual impasse. No answer is found. The reader, like the participants in the conversation, is left in a state of fruitful bewilderment. Plato at this stage is in no hurry to provide his own answers. His task is to show the Socratic method in action, to clear the mind of the refuse of false opinions, to demonstrate the full complexity of questions that seem so simple. This is philosophy in its purest, most critical form. It is an invitation not to the absorption of a doctrine, but to the act of thinking together, to the realization of the depths of one's own ignorance. Then the river of thought emerges onto a wide plain. The middle or classical period of Plato's work begins. Here the voice of the author himself starts to sound much more strongly, although it continues to speak through the mouth of Socrates. The Socrates of these dialogues is no longer so much a historical figure as a grand philosophical guide, confidently leading his listeners toward the light of truth. He no longer limits himself to criticism. He begins to build. It is in these dialogues that Plato sets forth the foundations of his own philosophical system, those ideas that have forever entered the treasury of human thought. Here in the dialogues Phaedo, Symposium, Phaedrus, and above all in the monumental Republic, his famous theory of ideas blossoms. Plato asserts that our visible world is merely a shadow, a copy of another true world, the world of eternal, perfect, and unchanging ideas or forms. It is there that true justice, true beauty, and the true good exist. He speaks of the immortality of the soul, which before its birth in a body once beheld these ideas, and thus the process of knowing is an amnesis, a recollection of what has been forgotten. He paints a grand project of an ideal state, where the rulers must be philosophers, those who are able to ascend to the contemplation of the world of ideas and bring its light into the darkness of human society. The dialogue itself changes its character during this period. It becomes less like a free-flowing argument and more like a didactic lecture, where Socrates delivers long speeches and his companions only occasionally agree with him. The dialogue form here serves more to ease the comprehension of complex doctrines, to break them into parts, to lead the reader step by step up the staircase of a magnificent theory. If the early dialogues were the clearing of a construction site, then the middle ones are the raising of the grand temple of Platonic metaphysics, ethics, and politics. But the journey does not end here. In the late period of his creative life, already a gray-haired patriarch of his academy, Plato does something astonishing. His river reaches its delta and fans out into countless complex deep channels. He returns to his own teachings with new, even more difficult questions. This is a period of the highest self-criticism and intellectual honesty. In the late dialogues, sophist statesmen, Parmenides, Timaeus, Laws, the figure of Socrates often recedes into the background or disappears entirely. The conversation is led by other characters, a nameless visitor from Alais, the sage Timaeus. The tone becomes drier, more technical, more abstract. Drama and poetry give way to a rigorous, almost mathematical logic. Plato, like a great architect inspecting the building he himself has erected, begins to test the strength of its very foundations. In the dialogue Parmenides, he subjects his own theory of ideas to a devastating critique, revealing all the logical difficulties and paradoxes that arise from it. How exactly are things related to ideas? Do ideas exist for dirty and lowly things? In The Sophist, he takes on the exceedingly difficult problem of non-being, trying to understand how we can speak of falsehood if it does not exist. This is no longer philosophy for the general public. These are conversations for initiates, for students who have already mastered the fundamentals and are ready for the most complex metaphysical puzzles. This is evidence that for Plato, Philosophy was never a frozen dogma. It was an eternal process, an unending dialogue, which he conducted not only with others, but with himself, until the very last days of his life. Thus, in observing this evolution, we see the complete life cycle of a thought, from youthful ardor and critical negation through mature confidence in the construction of one's own system, to a wise reflection and self-critique. And the form of the dialogue, like flexible clay in the hands of a master, changed along with the content, each time serving as the ideal instrument for whatever stage of the journey its great author was on. We have followed the current of Platonic thought from its source to its complex branching estuary. We have seen how the dialogue served as an instrument for the search for truth and as a form for the construction of magnificent theories. But was its purpose only this, the accumulation of knowledge and the creation of philosophical systems? For Plato, the answer would have been an unequivocal no. The ultimate aim of the dialogue is far deeper and more important. It lies not in filling the mind with information, but in transforming the soul itself. The dialogue for Plato is not simply a method of teaching. It is a practice that heals, orders, and perfects the human essence. It is at once gymnastics for the mind and music for the character. Let us imagine the mind as a muscle. Without training, it becomes weak, flaccid, and incapable of true effort. Everyday thoughts, chaotic impressions, the passive consumption of others' ideas, all of this is akin to a light stroll. It does not build strength. The dialogue in the form that Socrates practiced it is precisely this kind of intense, carefully designed gymnastics. Every one of its elements is aimed at training a specific group of intellectual muscles. It accustoms the mind to a discipline that it does not know in ordinary life. First, participation in a dialogue forces one toward clarity. In our own private thoughts, we often float in a fog of ambiguity. Our ideas seem clear to us until we try to express them. The dialogue demands that we formulate our position with precision and without equivocation, for every word will be examined under a microscope. Second, it trains our analytical abilities. We learn to break down complex arguments into their simpler components, to distinguish between premises and conclusions, to find hidden assumptions. The mind learns to be not merely a consumer, but an architect of thought. The unrelenting Elenchus acts as a strength training machine. It shows us the weak points in our argumentation, forcing us to exert ourselves and seek stronger foundations for our convictions. Following the logos, the thread of rational discourse, teaches us consistency and logical endurance. It is like learning to perform an exercise correctly in order to gain the maximum benefit and avoid doing harm. As a result of such constant training, the mind becomes flexible, strong, sharp, and resilient. It acquires the ability not just to react to external stimuli, but to independently investigate the world, to build sturdy structures of knowledge, and to distinguish the true from the false. This is the first pedagogical function of the dialogue, the cultivation of a true philosopher, an athlete of thought. But for Plato, this gymnastics for the mind was inextricably linked with the formation of character. The training of the intellect had direct ethical consequences. The path of dialectical inquiry is, at the same time, a path of moral perfection. In the crucible of a Socratic conversation, it was not only ideas that were forged, but virtues. The very first and most important of these is intellectual humility, to pass through aporia, through the complete realization of one's own ignorance in matters where one considered oneself an expert, is an exceptionally powerful and humbling experience. It is an inoculation against the most dangerous disease of the soul, pride, arrogance, the certainty of one's own knowledge in its absence. To admit I do not know is an act of courage that frees the soul from the shackles of illusion and opens it to true learning. This humility is the foundation for all other ethical qualities. The dialogue also cultivates courage, but of a special kind, intellectual courage. It takes considerable bravery to expose one's deepest, most cherished convictions to public scrutiny and ruthless examination. It takes courage to hear criticism, to admit one's mistake, and to abandon a false belief, even if it was comfortable and familiar. This readiness to follow the logos, no matter where it may lead, is a manifestation of a true love for the truth, a love that is higher than one's own ego. Furthermore, the dialogue is a school of self-control or temperance. It teaches us to restrain our emotions, not to become angry when our arguments are refuted, not to take offense at our interlocutor, not to strive for victory for its own sake. The goal is a shared search, not a personal triumph. This requires the ability to rule over one's passions, subordinating them to the higher goal of understanding. And finally, the dialogue is a practice of justice. It teaches us to be just toward the thoughts of others, to listen to them attentively, to try to understand them before we criticize. It teaches us to give due credit to the strength of another's argument, even if it demolishes our own position. In this small space of conversation, we learn the principles upon which a just society ought to be built. Thus, for Plato, the dialogue was not only a path to truth, but also a path to virtue, and this idea finds its highest expression in his political philosophy, the model of an ordered and harmonious soul, where the rational part governs the spirited and appetitive parts, becomes for him a direct blueprint for the construction of an ideal society, the polis. Just as in the soul, so too in the state, reason must reign. A well-ordered society, as described in the Republic, is in essence a society built upon the principles of dialogue. It is ruled not by tyrants guided by their own desires, nor by warriors guided by a thirst for glory, but by philosophers, those who have traveled the long road of dialectical gymnastics and have reached the contemplation of the idea of the good. Their authority is the authority of reason, of the logos. The laws in such a state are not arbitrary commands, but rationally justified principles aimed at the common good. The entire life of the polis, and especially the system of education for the future philosopher guardians, is permeated with the spirit of dialogue. It is a community that is in constant conversation with itself about what is good and what is just. A city without dialogue is chaos, a cacophony, where each individual or social class tries to satisfy its own selfish interests. It is a state of war of all against all, whether hidden or overt. A city that lives by the laws of dialogue is a symphony. Each of its parts performs its own function in harmony with the others, and altogether they create a single, beautiful, and coherent whole. Rational discourse, the shared search for truth, is the very life force, the breath that unites citizens and transforms a crowd into a community. And so for Plato, the path to personal perfection and the path to the creation of a just society were one and the same, the path of dialogue. We have traveled a long road, following the development of the Platonic dialogue. We have seen it as an instrument of knowing, as a crucible for the forging of virtues, and as an architectural plan for an ideal society. It would seem that its power is boundless, and its possibilities all-encompassing. But is this truly the case? Can the word, even the most refined, the most honest, and the most rational, comprehend absolutely everything? Do there not exist such depths of truth where all language becomes powerless, where conversation must give way to silent contemplation? It is here, at the very limits of the word, that we find the final, most subtle lessons of the Platonic heritage. There is a mysterious and still debated theory concerning the so-called unwritten doctrines of Plato, or the Agrapha Dogmata. Some scholars, relying on the testimony of his student Aristotle and on hints in the philosopher's own letters, believe that Plato never entrusted the most important, most profound aspects of his metaphysics to writing. This likely concerned the highest principles of being, the doctrine of the one and the indefinite dyad, from which the ideas themselves originate. Why? Because such wisdom, in his view, cannot be transmitted as ready-made information. It is not for the general public. Once written down in a text, it would inevitably be simplified, vulgarized, and misinterpreted by those whose souls are not prepared to receive it. True, highest knowledge, as Plato believed, can only be born from a long and living communion, from a shared life in philosophical inquiry, which he sought to embody in his academy. It flashes up in the soul suddenly, like a spark from a fire, after many conversations and reflections, and from then on, it lives a life of its own. The written dialogues, in this sense, are only an external preparatory stage. They are beautiful and perfect signposts on the path to the summit. They train the mind, purify the soul, and point out the direction, but they are not the summit itself. They can lead us to the gates of the temple, but to enter inside and have a direct experience of divine truth, the soul must do so on its own, in the silence that lies beyond all words. This is a reminder that any language, even philosophical language, is only an instrument, not an end in itself. In addition to this internal limitation, acknowledged perhaps by Plato himself, there are also external, modern shadows of critique that fall upon the shining figure of the Socratic method. Some ask, is Socrates always the honest, impartial seeker of truth that he appears to be, or perhaps behind the mask of irony and feigned ignorance does a skillful manipulator lie hidden, one who already knows the answer in advance and merely leads his interlocutor to it with great mastery, creating the illusion of a shared discovery. At times, the dialogue can indeed seem less like a free conversation and more like a finely staged play, where the roles are assigned beforehand and the finale is predetermined. Another shadow of critique concerns the elitism of this path. The dialectical method requires an enormous amount of time, leisure, and considerable intellectual preparation. It was a path accessible to the aristocratic youth of Athens, to the members of the academy. But is it a realistic path for the artisan, the farmer, the merchant? Is this grand gymnastics for the soul not a luxury inaccessible to the vast majority of people who are immersed in the daily concerns of survival? This is an important question about the social dimension of philosophy, one that forces us to consider whether this path to virtue and knowledge is not a privilege of the few. These critical reflections do not nullify the greatness of the dialogue, but they make our understanding of it more complete, showing that even the most perfect instrument has its context and its limits. Yet despite all limitations and critiques, the echo of the Platonic dialogue has not faded for 2.5 millennia. It is the stone cast into the waters of Western civilization, whose ripples continue to spread to this day. Its legacy is immense and multifaceted. The entire subsequent history of philosophy, as one thinker famously remarked, is but a series of footnotes to Plato, and the form of the dialogue, like its spirit, has continued to live on. The Roman orator and philosopher Cicero, captivated by the Platonic ideal, chose the very form of the dialogue to translate complex Greek ideas into the language and mentality of Rome. In the first centuries of Christianity, St. Augustine, in his early works, conducted dialogues where the interlocutors were himself, his reason, and his friends, exploring questions of faith, doubt, and the nature of God, thereby creating a bridge between ancient philosophy and the new theology. And in the modern era, the Irish bishop George Berkeley used dialogues to explain, in an accessible form, his complex idealist philosophy, where only spirit and ideas are real. The dialogue became a classic genre for the clash of opposing views, for the exploration of a problem from all sides. But perhaps its most important legacy lives on not in the pages of books, but in the very practice of education and critical thinking. Modern pedagogy, which strives not simply to stuff students with facts, but to teach them to think for themselves, is a direct heir of Socrates. The so-called Socratic seminars, where the instructor does not give a lecture, but asks questions, compelling students to analyze a text, defend their positions, and interact with one another, are a living tribute to the Platonic ideal. The ability to ask the right questions, to argue logically, to listen to an opponent, and to be open to changing one's mind. These are the skills that the dialogue cultivated then, and that are vitally necessary for any free and conscious person today. And so we have come to the end of our conversation about conversation. We have seen in the dialogue a path from ignorance to knowledge, from illusion to truth, from discord in the soul to harmony in society. We have also seen that this path has its limits, and that the highest wisdom, perhaps, begins where words fall silent. But it is in this very fact that its ultimate value lies. It does not grant us the comfort of ready-made answers. It leaves us in a state of fruitful, creative seeking. It teaches us the art of asking questions, the art of listening, the art of thinking together, and this quiet, persistent echo of the Socratic voice, which calls us to reflection, to self-knowledge, to honest conversation, is perhaps the most precious gift that this ancient and eternally living philosophical tradition has left us.